What's up, Wonders of London fans on YouTube? How are you guys doing? My name is Vincent and I'm a tour guide with Wonders of London. We're a tour guiding company and we do tours all around London and outside London as well. And we thought we'd do something quite interesting to give you little tasters of some of our tours. And today we're going to be checking out the Royal Westminster Tour, which is one of our best performing tours. So follow me and I'll show you a little bit around Royal Westminster and we'll get to discover about Royal Westminster. Let's go. I am currently in the Victoria Tower Gardens, which as you can see are very, very beautiful with the autumn colours coming through. Your closest station to the Victoria Tower Gardens is Westminster Station, but here we are, Victoria Tower Gardens. The Victoria Tower Gardens are right by the Houses of Parliament, and over here we can see the Victoria Tower itself with the Union flag flying high. It is also known as the Union Jack, and the Victoria Tower is of course named after Queen Victoria. It is the tower we can see just over there. Very beautiful tower. The Victoria Tower Gardens boast some phenomenal views of the mighty River Thames, as you can see over here. And in fact, you can get a wonderful shot of the London Eye from the Victoria Tower Gardens, as you can see in the distance over there. Later on, we're going to get a better view of the London Eye, but how gorgeous is this, guys? The Victoria Tower Gardens boast some brilliant monuments and memorials like the Buxton Memorial, which was erected to commemorate the emancipation of the slaves following the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act. The memorial was donated by Charles Buxton MP in memory of his father Sir Thomas Fowell Buxton and those associated with him in the struggle for the abolition of slavery in the British colonies in America. At this time, the king in Britain was William IV, and of course he is also known as the Sea King. We're going to talk a bit more about some fantastic kings and queens on this particular tour as we walk around Royal Westminster, but this memorial offers some phenomenal photo opportunities like this of the brilliant Victoria Tower itself. Ahead of us over there is another lovely monument, and this is a sculpture by Auguste Rodin, the famous French artist, and we can see it is the Burghers of Calais, and these were principal residents or citizens of Calais, and in fact they were arrested during the 100 Years' War between England and France, and they were taken out of town with ropes around their necks as prisoners, and they were brought before King Edward III of England, who sentenced them to death. However, just before they were to be executed, they were eventually released, and it is here in the Victoria Tower Gardens where you can get a look at this magnificent work of art that is connected to British royal history, and of course it's right here in Royal Westminster, which we're going to be exploring a bit more and looking at some more fantastic stories of the royal family and Westminster. The Victoria Tower entrance has some wonderful architecture, and it's a brilliant example of Gothic revivalist architecture, as we can see some of it over here. They're doing some construction works at the Houses of Parliament, so we can't enjoy it in all of its beauty, but have a look at this. How photogenic or photogenic is this? As I mentioned, they're doing a lot of work on the Houses of Parliament, and you can see the scaffolding going along over there. And did you know that the Houses of Parliament are also known as the Palace of Westminster? And this particular set of buildings, the Houses of Parliament, aka the Palace of Westminster, were actually built after 1834. Because in 1834, when William IV was king once again, we had a big fire break out in the Houses of Parliament. And of course, that destroyed the former Houses of Parliament. There was a kind of competition for a new architect to design the new buildings that we see over here. And the person who won that particular competition was Charles Barry. And Charles Barry designed the new Houses of Parliament we are looking at now. He worked very closely with another brilliant architect who actually did most of the interior of the Houses of Parliament, and this was an individual called Augustus Pugin, or Augustus Welby Pugin. The fire in the Houses of Parliament destroyed most of the former Houses of Parliament before 1834, but certain bits did survive that great fire, and one of the bits that survived the fire is this stone building that we can see just ahead of us over there, which is known as the Jewel Tower. So we can see a little bit of what the former Houses of Parliament looked like compared to the new Houses of Parliament that we can see with the wonderful Victoria Tower over there. So we can see the different stonework, the different colours and different styles of architecture as we go around this way. Now, Charles Barry used a very interesting kind of stone. He made a mistake because he used the wrong stone. And in fact, in the 1800s, London was severely polluted. There was so much pollution in London and England. And the stone he used was not very resilient to pollution. And as such, there was erosion from pollution and damage from pollution on the Victoria Tower and the Houses of Parliament themselves. And in fact, one of the spires on top of the tower over there actually crumbled away and collapsed into the Victoria Tower gardens where we were earlier. And it was quite a sad state of affairs. Interestingly enough, if you've ever been to the Natural History Museum, you'll probably find that that is a very beautiful building from a similar time period, and that was designed by Sir Alfred Waterhouse. And Sir Alfred Waterhouse knew about this pollution, and what he decided to do was use terracotta, which is a bit more resilient to the 1800s pollution, and as such that particular building got to survive a bit better than the one we're looking at now with the Victoria Tower just over there. Another famous English king is this king that we can see over here, George V, and he ruled between 1910 and 1936. You can find his statue just here at the backside of the Westminster Abbey, which is the royal church, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a few moments. But George V was an amazing king. He of course was king during World War I, and as you might know, World War I, the enemy was primarily the Germans, and George V was actually the first Windsor monarch. Our current queen, Elizabeth II, is a Windsor. However, George V had to change the name from their former German name of Saxe-Coburg to Windsor because they did not want to be associated with the enemy, who would have been the Germans at the time during World War I. So that is the amazing George V, and he is quite a phenomenal king of Britain. Another famous English king can be found right here where we have the scaffolding at the Houses of Parliament, and that is of course Richard I, who you can see riding his horse over there. Richard I is also known as Richard de Liancourt or Richard the Lionheart, and he is known as one of the bravest kings in English history. And in fact, he's a much loved king in history. Most of you might recognize Richard the Lionheart from Robin Hood. He's the good King Richard who is off fighting in the Crusades. And of course, he's always portrayed as the good king when compared to Prince John, his brother, the bad guy in Robin Hood. Now, very few people actually know that that is a bit of propaganda. Richard the Lionheart, Richard I, was actually not as good a king as you might imagine. And in fact, Richard I pretty much hated England and London. Of his somewhat 10-year rule, he spent only about 6 months in England. Most of his time was spent in the Crusades or in France, and in fact it is said he shared the bed of the King of France for 4 years. Another interesting thing is that at this time, English was not the language of courts, and as such, despite being born in England, Richard I did not speak English. So what we have is an English king who did not speak the language. He also did not spend more than 6 months in England during his rule. Another fascinating thing is, as I mentioned, he probably did not like England. It is actually said that Richard I said either he would sell all of England or all of London if anyone could afford it. So what do you guys think of Richard I over there? Over here we have the statue of a man I hate very, very much. Now, to explain why I hate him, this is Oliver Cromwell. I am half Irish, half African, and in fact he did not treat any of my countrymen, wherever they come from, very well. Oliver Cromwell laid the foundations of what would later become the RAC, the Royal African Company, which was founded by King Charles II. And the RAC would pretty much turn slavery into what we know today as the transatlantic slave trade. And of course, from my African side, I don't like Oliver Cromwell for that particular reason. However, from my Irish side, a lot of Irish people are not fans of Oliver Cromwell. And in fact, he would send his soldiers over to Ireland, where they killed a lot of Irish people, brutalized more Irish people, and in fact sent a lot of Irishmen and Irish women over to the American continent and other continents as indentured servants. And indentured servants, it's quite complicated, but they are pretty much 2 steps above slaves. And in Ireland, we hate Oliver Cromwell so much, we actually have a song about hating him. This song was written by a man called Ron Kavanagh, but it was made famous by the band The Pogues. And I always like to sing this song on my Royal Westminster tours and my Spice tour. And the song goes something like, well, since Cromwell pushed us westward to live our lowly lives, some of us have deemed to fight from Tipperary mountains high. Noble men with wills of iron, who are not afraid to die, and will fight for Gaelic honour held on high. A curse upon you, Oliver Cromwell, who robbed our motherland. I hope you rotting down in hell for the horrors that you sent to our misfortunate forefathers, whom you robbed of their birthright to hell Connaught. May you burn in hell tonight. Thank you. No X Factor for me, although my mum thinks I would win the X Factor. And in fact, some English people hate Oliver Cromwell as well. And in fact, to give an example of why they hate him, he tried to make drinking illegal, but he was not successful. He made gambling illegal. He also made theatre going illegal. And when he made theatre going illegal, this would eventually result in the demolition of the Rose Theatre, which was the first theatre on Bankside, on the other side of the river, but also the Hope Theatre and the Globe Theatre. Shakespeare's Globe Theatre was knocked down because of Oliver Cromwell. So lots of people who love literature and the theatre are not fans of Oliver Cromwell. But another reason some people don't like Oliver Cromwell is because he technically made Christmas illegal. The reason we talk about Oliver Cromwell on the Royal Westminster Tour is because he was one of the principal players or principal participants in the English Civil War in the 1640s. The English Civil War was between the parliamentarians, the governments, who have their base over there, and the royalists. And of course, Westminster Abbey over here is one of the royal buildings. It is the royal church. And this was between the parliamentarians, the government, and the royalists, the royal family. And at the end of the English Civil War, the parliamentarians won. They defeated the royalists, and this resulted in the execution of King Charles I, who is the only king in English history to have been executed by his people. After that, Cromwell became Lord Protector of England. However, as I mentioned earlier, the English were not big fans of Cromwell after a while. And in fact, after Cromwell died, he named his successor to be Richard Cromwell. However, the English were so fed up with the Cromwells and the government that they decided to get rid of Richard Cromwell. Now, one interesting thing is that after they got rid of him, we had the Restoration, and Charles I's son, the executed king, his son came back and became Charles II. Now, Charles II hated Oliver Cromwell more than I hate Oliver Cromwell. In fact, Cromwell had been buried here in Westminster Abbey, where more than 3,300 people are buried. If you ever go inside, come to this section of the Abbey on the interior, and you will find a little plaque that says, "This is where Oliver Cromwell was buried." Now, the reason it says this is where Oliver Cromwell was buried is because Charles II, whose father, Charles I, had been executed under the orders of Oliver Cromwell, decided to have Cromwell's body dug up. It was then dragged through the abbey across the nave and taken to a place called Tyburn, where Cromwell's dead body was posthumously executed. Imagine hating someone so much, you execute them after they're dead. This is how much Charles II hated Oliver Cromwell, who we can see once again over there. And in fact, Cromwell's head was put on a pike for several years until it was eventually liberated and then buried in an unknown location on the grounds of the University of Cambridge. So no one actually knows where the head of Oliver Cromwell is today. Now here on St. Margaret's Church, we have a bust, a statue of the head and shoulders of King Charles I, the man who was executed under the orders of Oliver Cromwell. Now, very interestingly, if you ever come here, be sure to look into the eyes of Charles I and then gaze to the other side where we have the Houses of Parliament, because what you see is Oliver Cromwell gazing into the eye of Charles I, the man he had executed. So it is a very, very interesting placement for these two mortal enemies. Now, behind the bus, we have a wonderful photo opportunity of the London Eye. And if you look closely, there is a statue, and the spear statue, if you go to the right angle, you can center it in the middle of the London Eye like this. Boudicca was an Iceni queen almost 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, the Romans invaded Britain and they built what they called Londinium. Today we call Londinium the City of London. The locals, like Queen Boudicca and her daughters, the British people, were not happy with the Romans and the way they were treating the British people. And as such, Boudicca launched a revolution, and she killed many, many Roman soldiers in her war against the Romans. However, she lost the war. And rather than be captured, executed and tortured by the Romans, Boudicca decided to burn the city of London, which you can find in that general direction over there, before taking some poison and killing herself. And Boudicca is one of the most important women in British history. Over here we can see that the Elizabeth Tower, which is also known as Big Ben, is not yet complete and still covered in scaffolding. Now, they estimated that they would finish the job of repairing the Elizabeth Tower, aka Big Ben, this year in 2021. However, because of COVID, that might be pushed back to next year, 2022. And they think that they will finish the work on the Elizabeth Tower, if all goes well, hopefully before the end of the year, but more likely than not in 2022 during the first quarter, meaning somewhere between January and March. So we wait to see Big Ben returning and ringing in London once again. The beautiful building in the distance just over there is the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is in fact open to the public. And if you ever visit it, you have to go in through a lot of security and metal detectors, but once you are inside, you can visit some of the courtrooms if there are no sessions taking place. Another fascinating thing about the Supreme Court is if you go to the basements, they have an amazing gallery giving you the history of the Supreme Court, and one of the best things you'll find is a modernized copy of King John's Magna Carta, or as some people call it, the Magna Carta. Over here we have one of the most famous photo opportunities of Westminster Abbey, and within the grounds of Westminster Abbey and next to the Abbey is this beautiful little church over there, which is St Margaret. And in St Margaret, it's believed that Sir Walter Raleigh is buried there without his head, because after his execution at the Houses of Parliament, a legend has it that his wife secreted his head away, and when he was buried without his head. So Walter Raleigh was one of the favourites of Queen Elizabeth I. However, King James I, who was also James VI, he was James VI of Scotland and James I of England, hated Walter Raleigh so much that he eventually had Walter Raleigh executed in 1618 at the Houses of Parliament just there. Westminster Abbey is a simply majestic building that many of the great architects of England have worked on, including Sir Nicholas Hawksmoor and Sir Christopher Wren, to name just two. It is a very photogenic church full of royal history, and in fact it is the Royal Church. There has been a place of worship at Westminster Abbey since the year 960, when it was a Benedictine monastery, and in fact at that time what we're standing on now was an island called Thorney Island in the middle of the River Thames. In 1065, Edward the Confessor decided to build his coronation church here, and in fact he was not able to be coronated here. Sadly, he died before he could be coronated. The first king to be coronated here at Westminster Abbey was William the Conqueror, who would become William I. And ever since then, every king and queen or monarch of England has been coronated right there in Westminster Abbey, right up to Elizabeth II. It is not entirely accurate, however, to say every king and queen since William the Conqueror has been coronated here at Westminster Abbey, because Edward V was believed to have been murdered in the Tower of London before his coronation, and Edward VIII was actually decided to abdicate before his coronation, 11 months after he had succeeded his father. So the two kings who were not coronated here at Westminster Abbey are of course Edward V and Edward VIII. Westminster Abbey is also the burial place of more than 3,300 people, including some 17 monarchs. You also have the Poets' Corner, where many famous writers are buried, including the likes of Charles Dickens. We also have the Scientists' Corner, where Isaac Newton is buried. Whenever you visit the Abbey, be sure, however, to look closely, because you will see some plaques of people who were not actually buried over here. For example, we have a Shakespeare memorial in Westminster Abbey. However, Shakespeare was not buried in the Abbey. He was buried in Stratford upon Avon. This beautiful building here is Central Hall, Westminster, which is also known as the Methodist Central Hall. My favourite park in London is St James's Park, where if you're lucky you can find black swans and pelicans. And I love St James's because of all its nature, but also because of this lovely little cottage. Imagine living here. If you lived here, your nearest neighbours would be Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace, which we're going to see later on, or the Prime Minister, Mr Boris Johnson, at number 10 Downing Street just there. The cottage is simply a peaceful place. It is of course not inhabited, and they usually use it as storage or offices depending on the time of year. St James's Park is full of wonderful animals and birds and waterfowl, including Canada geese, Egyptian geese, swans, the white variety, and of course black swans, like we can see just over there as well. How beautiful is that? 350 years ago, workmen dug a canal in St James's Park for the enjoyment of the fun-loving King Charles II. And the king would actually swim in the canal that was here in St James's Park. So imagine coming to St James's Park and you find King Charles II swimming in the park. After the restoration in the 1600s and Charles II became king once again, he hired a French landscape gardener to redesign this wonderful park. And of course he loved all of the French architecture and French gardening, so he did make many changes to the wonderful St James's Park that we are walking through right now. And if you ever come to our Royal Westminster tour, you too will be able to walk through this phenomenal park. As well as black swans, a wide variety of waterfowl can be found in St James's Park, including the 6 pelicans of St James's Park that have taken over this bench. How cool is that? Please do not get too close to the pelicans or the swans because they have been known to bite. Also be sure to look out for the beautiful Egyptian geese. Another thing I love about St James's Park are the beautiful flowers and beautiful colours you get in this fantastic park. St James's Park, with its beautiful gates, has its humble beginnings as a farm, mostly for pigs. However, King Henry VIII, who I like to call the worst husband in history, loved hunting, and he decided to turn that farm into a hunting ground. As well as changing it into a hunting ground, he decided to build a hunting cottage on this site just outside St James's Park. That hunting lodge would evolve to become the beautifully magnificent St James's Palace, which for many years was actually the headquarters and London residence of the monarchs of England. How beautiful is this building? Just outside St James's Palace in St James's Park, we have this beautiful sculpture and memorial to Queen Alexandra. And if you want to find out more about the amazing kings and queens of England and the history of London, then why not check us out on Facebook, where we have more videos and lives as well, or check out one of our many tours around London. As we mentioned, Henry VIII put his stamp on St James's Park, but after that St James's Park and Westminster as well were changed by Charles II, another monarch who greatly influenced Westminster. And of course St James's Park was George IV. George IV was initially known as the Prince Regent, and in fact George IV worked very closely with a famous English architect called John Nash, and the present landscape of the park was designed by the architect John Nash from 1826 to 1827, and together with the Prince Regent, who would later be George IV, they made quite a lot of changes to this very beautiful park, and the park is still in the spirit of John Nash. The Prince Regent, aka George IV, loved a good party, and in fact, to give an example of how much he loved partying, we used to have a very different bridge than what we see over the lake in St James's Park today. This simple blue bridge replaced a much more complex and beautiful wooden bridge that was built in a Chinese architectural style. But of course, the Prince Regent, also known as George IV, loved a good party, and he especially loved fireworks. And in fact, If you were here on August the 1st, 1814, you would have seen a very different bridge. And that bridge is this bridge catching fire. So imagine how beautiful the bridge was. But the fireworks were not stored correctly, and as such they hit the bridge, and sadly it caught fire and collapsed, eventually being replaced by that blue bridge we see over there. That bridge, however, has some wonderful views, including this beautiful and picturesque photo opportunity of Buckingham Palace and the Queen Victoria Memorial in the distance there. The bridge also offers you this wonderful view of Whitehall Place, the Horse Guards Parade, the London Eye and the Shard over the lake just here, as you can see. How picturesque is that? John Nash, the architect, who was very instrumental in having St James's Park designed, worked on many famous buildings in England and London, including the Brighton Pavilion in Brighton, Regent's Park in London, and Regent Street, named after the Prince Regent, who would later be George IV. Of course, one of the most epic buildings he worked on was Buckingham Palace. Buckingham Palace wasn't always a palace. In fact, it began as the London residence of the Duke of Buckinghamshire, and when it was built it was known as Buckingham House. King George III, who sadly went down in history as the Mad King because he suffered from certain mental health issues, would buy Buckingham House as a pied à terre, which, if my French is not too terrible, means small house in the city or town. The Prince Regent, who would later be known as George IV, who of course was the son of George III, would eventually, due to some financial mismanagement on his part, decide to turn Buckingham House into a palace, extended so it would become Buckingham Palace, and he hired John Nash to do this job. Now, the Prince Regent, also known as George IV, loved a good party, and as such, he was always broke. If you've ever seen Blackadder, they did an amazing season of Blackadder with Hugh Laurie, who also played Dr. House, but in Blackadder he plays the Prince Regent. And we can see how terrible the Prince Regent was with money, particularly because he loved to party and he was quite a fashionable individual. However, he would eventually decide to expand Buckingham Palace, a house, and turn it into a palace. But the government gave them around £300,000, and John Nash had to be fired from that job because he spent too much money, which gives us an idea of how terrible the Prince Regent, who would later be George IV, was with money. The beautiful palace with its magnificent gates was eventually completed many years after the death of George IV, the Prince Regent. And in fact, his own brother, his successor, William IV, did not get to live in Buckingham Palace. The first monarch to live in Buckingham Palace as a palace was the great Queen Victoria, whose memorial we can find here just outside Buckingham Palace. The Victoria Memorial is a great memorial to one of the greatest queens of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. There is so much detail and so many fascinating anecdotes and things going on with this phenomenal monument. And in the center over there is the great Queen Victoria herself. So we've arrived at the end of our mini version of our Royal Westminster tour, and once again we can look upon the beautiful St James's Park. Here you get one of my favourite views from St James's Park. simply gorgeous. I hope you've enjoyed this mini tour. And if you want to find out more about Royal Westminster, then why not check out one of our Royal Westminster tours in person. And in fact, you can check out any one of our other tours, and we've got some amazing tour guides, a really brilliant team of tour guides, including myself, and we've got several different tours all over London and outside London as well. And of course, if you want to see a few more videos and lives of London, why not check us out on Facebook, where we've got several videos, almost 2 years worth of videos and lives on our Facebook page, Wonders of London on Facebook, and you will not be disappointed. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed this mini version of our Royal Westminster tour, and of course do have a lovely rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, etc. wherever you are. Bye.